And we're back. Today we'll be hearing from Neil Faulkner, who will be speaking on advancing process safety data analysis and winterization. Neil is currently the process safety manager at Phillips 66 and has 31 years of refinery operations experience at multiple locations, including in the UK. Neil has held operations manager roles at the Ponca City, Oklahoma, and Wood River, Illinois refineries, and served as the refinery manager at the Alliance, Louisiana refinery from 2015 to 19. Neil began his career in 1990 at the Humber refinery in the UK, where he held various positions, including process engineering, operations planning, operations supervision, before moving across the Atlantic to the USA in 2005, initially at Sweeney, Texas refinery. Quite a journey, Neil, from the Northeast UK to Sweeney, Texas. Quite a cultural journey. So Neil earned a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Birmingham in the UK in 1990. Please welcome Neil, and I look forward to our discussion.
All right, great. Thanks, Bill. Thanks for that introduction. And thank you, everybody, for joining me for this presentation. I'm going to talk about the Advancing Process Safety Program. And I'd also like to thank the AFPM staff for the opportunity to speak and for their work making this conference happen, and their flexibility to switch it and make it happen in this virtual format. So, so first thing I kind of want to say is I'm proud of what the men and women of our industry do. You know, making the transportation fuels, the chemical building blocks that underpin our economy and contribute so much to modern life. And my experience has taught me of all the challenges that are involved in processing, storing thousands of barrels a day of highly flammable materials, and how it requires hundreds of employees, contractors working together on a daily basis to kind of make this big jigsaw puzzle fit together. And that experience has also taught me a lot about the importance of process safety. And so as a manager in a refinery, I had some knowledge of the resources that were available through the Advancing Process Safety Program, but I'd say I've learned more about that in my current role. And I hope that one of the outcomes of today's presentation might be that somebody goes away with a better understanding of some of the networking, the knowledge, the information that's available through this really good program. So for anyone who might not be familiar, the Advancing Process Safety Program was developed jointly by AFPM and API in the early 2010s as an industry effort to improve process safety performance. And the program's overseen by an advisory group that consists of senior executives from member companies, but it's driven by people from across our entire industry who give their time and effort to improve process safety for everybody. Some of the subgroups that are part of the program specialize in things like practice sharing, mechanical integrity, walk the line, and human reliability, just to give you a little flavor. By the way, as I go forward, I'm probably going to refer to the Advancing Process Safety Program as I'll use the acronym APS. So in the presentation, I'm going to give a brief review of industry process safety performance and discuss how APS has helped contribute to the improvements over time. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the recent work that's been done by members of the group, which is going to help set direction for the program going forwards for the next several years, and to help us to continue to drive process safety improvement over the next several years. And maybe one other thing, I just draw your attention. We have a panel discussion that's coming up later on, I think at 12:30, where some of the key players who were involved in the initial setup of the program are going to give further insights into its development and their contributions to improve performance. I'd really encourage you all to listen to that panel discussion. So if you go to the next slide, so many people, I'm sure, on the call will already be familiar with the data on this slide. It shows Tier 1 process safety event rates for both the US refining industry on the left and then the petrochemical industry on the right. And this is going back to 2010, which was when the industry first began consistently tracking the metric under the guidance of API Practice 754. As you probably already know, and you can see on the charts, both sectors of the industry have shown significant process safety performance improvement over this time. The refining industry, a greater than 50% improvement if you just look at the straight numbers from 2010 to 2020. And as you can see, the 5-year rolling average for both sectors also continues to improve. I also think it's important when I look at this slide, it's important to recognize that the data over the last 5 years, so from 2016 onwards, for both refining and for petrochemical industries, the performance is about flat. And so that naturally leads to the questions, well, what next? What do we need to do as an industry to continue to improve? And how do we kind of take our performance to the next level? And that's some of the questions that the APS program is trying to answer a little bit. If you go on to the next slide, this shows the same chart for tier 2 process safety events. So in theory, a little lower severity on these events. And again, significant performance improvement. Interestingly, the refining data on the left-hand side there tells a slightly different story. So tier 2 event rates continuing to improve over the last 5 years, where maybe the tier 1 rates have flattened out a little bit. So other than the breakdown between tier 1 and tier 2 events, what this event rate data doesn't tell us is any information about severity of events or overall risk. And as members of the APS program discuss this data, one of the debates has been, do we follow like the same model as personal safety, where kind of old kind of safety theory says you prevent the simplest incidents on the bottom of the accident triangle, and that helps you to prevent more serious events? Or should we just be focusing on prevention of the most severe events? And I think the answer from the debate, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later on, there's kind of 2 strands. One is we need to work across the broad spectrum to reduce frequency of all process safety events. So for example, with programs like MI programs like CUI, improving our procedures, things like that. And then we also need to be especially focused on prevention of the most serious events. For example, by knowing what our most significant risks are and making sure we've got safeguards in place to address those risks. I think we need to do both. The recent change to API 754 that was going to require event severity to be tracked is also going to help with this focus on most serious events. I think it's a really important change. It's also worth saying API 754 severity, by design, it focuses on what exactly happened, and it doesn't consider the harder to measure aspect of potential, because that can sometimes, of course, be a matter of opinion. So API 754 severity, it's going to be used across the industry for benchmarking, so it needs to be very well defined and consistently used. But I think at the same time, individual companies have developed their own measures of risk, which do include some measure of potential. And I'd advocate that that's an important consideration in tracking the company's overall process safety performance improvement. So on the next slide, just a little bit on, so how has the APS program contributed to the observed performance improvement, and how's it going to continue to contribute going forwards? So as I talk about this, I thought I'd go back to the original guiding principles of the program. So these were developed 10 years ago, what's shown on this slide. And so the original objective of the program was to drive a step change improvement in process safety performance over 5 years. And the program has not been prescriptive. Rather, it's allowed for different approaches to different situations. And probably one of the most powerful aspects of APS has been the opportunity for broad participation, networking, and overall sharing of process safety information and best practices. And that's been both proactive and kind of reactive to incidents. So what I mean by that, it's included things like, so there's a really good group of regional networks that share information that kind of fosters grassroots process safety information sharing. They share hazard ID documents, which help to proactively share information about hazards and best practices, as well as kind of reactive learning from incident sharing. One other thing it's worth mentioning, in addition to one part of the APS program has been what's called the Process Safety Site Assessment Program, or PSAP for short. That part of the program has performed more than 130 assessments since its inception in 2012. And that's where experts are going, visiting facilities, assessing and giving feedback to those facilities in the areas of leadership, operating procedures, MI, safe work practices, MOCs, PHAs, and facility siting. And I think that's been a really important part of the program. And there's some really good data from those assessments, which I'll talk about again just a little bit later. I also think it's worth maybe addressing the first of those guiding principles, which was kind of focusing on industry performance and not working stakeholder relationships. So that was I think at the times, we'll get some more perspective on this in the panel discussion later on, but I think that was a deliberate focus to kind of get the house in order. And I do believe that the industry now has got a better story that we can show our stakeholders around process safety performance, and it's important and appropriate that we share that. I also strongly believe there's no room for rest, there's no room for complacency, and we've got to continue to improve. So we talked a little bit about what APS has done in the past. So what about now to the future? So if you go on to the next slide. So right now, the APS working group and the subgroups are midway through developing what the future strategy is going to be for the program. And this slide summarizes kind of where we're at with that work. So in the first half of 2020, excuse me, a group of plant managers and a wider population that was familiar with the program was surveyed. And we asked what they valued about APS. And then the second thing that's been done is in the first half of this year, once all the 2020 process safety event data was available, there's been a pretty detailed analysis of 5 years worth of the industry data. And that's we refer into that as a deep dive. And so those two things, plus a review of the findings and the data from those site assessment protocols, we kind of put all that stuff together and using that to try to figure out what the focus needs to be, the focus areas ought to be for APS going forwards. And happily, we were actually able to have a face-to-face meeting here with the working group back in June. We kind of managed to get that in the middle of things here in the middle of this pandemic, and I was really pleased to have it. And so that's the kind of stage that we're at right now. And we're in the process of developing a 5-year strategic plan for APS going forwards. So when we looked at the survey data, if you go to the next slide, really a reinforcement of a couple of things that I've already talked about. There was a lot of value for the networking, information sharing opportunities that are offered by this program. The same debate that I touched on already about how to focus on prevention of the most serious events versus the kind of general pool of events, that same debate kind of came through in the survey data. And so I've already talked about that, and I'll touch on that a little bit more later on. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail here so you can get a bit more of a flavor of what this deep dive, what it entailed. So there's now a vast amount of data available on types and causes of process safety events since we started gathering all this information back in 2010. I know which unit they happened in, what mode of operation, what failed, different causal factors. So this slide shows the top 5 types of process safety event that came through from that analysis of the data. So again, this was the data of process safety events, but also kind of looking at the data from PSAP assessments as well. So freeze and winterization was a clear standout as one type of process safety event. And bear in mind that this data set was prior to the February 2021 severe cold weather, which impacted a lot of the Gulf Coast. So when we were having this meeting, a lot of that experience was fresh in everybody's minds as well. Dead legs was second on the list. In many respects, that's related in a lot of respects to freeze. And I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on the data later on in the presentation, but kind of summarizing a lot of work. I'd say there were no major surprises in the event types. There's no kind of, not expected, there's no kind of one magic thing that we can go do. We have to work on a broad range of things to prevent process safety events. But one other thing that kind of clearly came through is there's a pretty large pool of information, whether it's hazard documents, event sharing information that already exists to help us to address all of those event types that are listed there. I think some of the challenge and the future focus of APS is how to make all that information, how do we make it available at the right time, in the right format, to the right person, so that it can be turned into specific action that's going to drive action and prevent events at a given facility. How do we kind of, how does the program continue to provide this data, but in a more usable way? So, if you go on to the next slide, I just included this. This is just an example of some existing work product and information that's available. And then this is an example of some documentation and prevention techniques around prevention of tank overflow events, which was the third topic on that list. Again, my point here of showing this is the knowledge exists. There's all kinds of documents available, ranging from there's formal recommended practices on how to prevent tank overfill, standards, to more informal practice shares and things like this. So our challenge is to turn that into appropriate action at a facility in order to prevent events. So on the next slide, just delving a little bit further into so you can get a flavor for how we delved into the data a little bit further. This is some more detail on some of the freeze incidents. And again, bear in mind, this was prior to February 2021. We looked at all our freeze incidents on a severity weighted basis. So we did not have severity data for every single event going forwards. That'll get addressed with the new version of API 754. But where we did, we were able to use it. And so for example, when we looked at incidents on a severity weighted basis, the tank farms was the #1 area, but then vapor recovery and light ends comes kind of right up. If you look at that second set of bullet points there, if you just look at number of freeze incidents, just straight number, vapor recovery and light ends appears much lower. When you take severity index weighting into account, it kind of makes a big difference. And I think it's important for us to, look at the data in that way. On the causal factors of these winterization events, the three most selected were procedures, design, and human factors. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that causal factor data and how we can use it, or how we can continue to improve that data to better use it going forward. So I've got that coming up here in a later slide. If you go on to the next slide, this is just as part of the exercise that the working groups looked at what information was already available. And so this slide is just kind of reinforcing that there's numerous existing resources on the subject of winterization on the AFPM safety portal, whether it's hazard ID documents, safety bulletins, or event sharing. If you go to the next slide, here are some of the possible actions that the working groups identified that could be taken to improve winterization management. And the groups talked quite a bit about kind of shifting to think of winterization as a year-round exercise, maybe kind of drawing on our experiences as an industry of developing hurricane plans kind of here on the Gulf Coast. And I expect, if anybody, all the folks that are watching from northern facilities probably would say they already do this, but there's some clear learnings for facilities that are based further south. So one example, for instance, that kind of came through as we were talking about this was a realization a number of facilities had problems with nitrogen supply during the recent cold weather. And I know from a prior experience that it's important to have a plan for nitrogen supply, a plan for nitrogen conservation. What options are there for reduction in nitrogen use? What are the priorities for nitrogen use in the plant? And it's far better to have that already developed than to be developing that in the middle of a cold snap. So just one example of where we actually thought there's an example of where APS could maybe help develop some materials. So this slide was developed as part of the initial brainstorm during the working group face-to-face meetings. And so again, this is kind of giving you, hopefully just giving you a flavor. The individual subgroups are now working on how they can get their teeth into this issue and how they can better develop and provide better sharing documents that really, again, get the information, hopefully get the information to the right people at the right time. So I mentioned a couple of times the large quantity of data that's now available on process safety events. And including causal factor data. There is a limitation with that data. So for example, on that previous slide I mentioned, we talked about how procedures was selected as a causal factor in 40% of freeze events. But what about procedures? It's hard to do much with that data without an additional level of detail. So with the forthcoming update to API 754, hopefully this is going to get addressed. And starting with the data gathered for events in 2021 and going forwards, there's going to be there should be an additional level of detail. So for example, on procedures, you can see here, if somebody selects procedures as a cause of a process safety event, there's a further level of detail. So what was it about the procedure? Was it an operating procedure, a maintenance procedure, or a contractor procedure? And then what was it about it? No procedure available, or the procedure wasn't accurate or clear. So really a whole nother level of detail, which I think will help us. This is going to take time to develop, to gather the data, but will help us again in giving us better insights and therefore better actions to prevent future process safety events. So I didn't want to leave the topic of how can the APS program help improve safety performance in future without talking a little bit about the role of human and organizational performance. I know there's been a couple of other presentations on this topic, and I think it's really important. My thought is that this remains an area where our industry can improve our understanding and apply better science to help prevent process safety events. And by the way, I should have titled this slide Human and Organizational Performance rather than just kind of human performance. So when we looked at the 2020 process safety event data across the industry and the causal factors that were selected, I was just looking at this morning. In more than 60% of events, some kind of factor related to human and organizational performance was selected, whether it was something to do with design, procedures, human factors, knowledge and skills, or whatever. That's something to do with human performance in at least 60% of events. So similarly, just in Phillips 66, we kind of look at a very simple first cut of process safety events, and we kind of, we'll call it human and organizational performance cause if someone did or didn't do something, and then an MI cause if something broke. And we see about around 50-50 to 60-40 split of MI to human and organizational performance events when you use that really simple first cut. But of course, dig deeper, and there are normally human and organizational performance causes that sit behind the MI events as well. So for example, tank overfill events, which showed up as on our list, typically they result from some kind of human error or combination of errors. So I think understanding how and why errors occur, using a systematic approach to prevent them is important for our industry going forwards, particularly as safeguards against our most serious events. And I believe that's an area where APS can further develop tools to help our industry going forwards. So this final slide is really just a summary of, I covered quite a bit of ground, summary of some of the things that I've talked about. So I think the APS program it's been and it remains an important driver in continuous improvement of our industry's process safety performance. And again, I think we'll have more insights into that when in listening to the panel discussion later. I talked about two strands of question. I think it's important, very important, to have systems that identify and put safeguards in place for the largest, highest risk, highest severity events. But then also to work across the broad base of prevention of tier 1 and tier 2 process safety events. One huge benefit of APS, and it will continue to be going forwards, is that general networking, knowledge, and information sharing. The data says that the events we're having, they're not new. We're not experiencing kind of big new events. So it's kind of the knowledge is out there. The challenge is all that useful information that's already there. The challenge is to make that information available in the right way that facilities that management teams in facilities can use it, that it gets to the people that matter. I think the Walk the Line program, which has been part of the APS program, is a really good example of developing materials that were meaningful and useful to frontline people who are actually on the valves doing the work. And then the quality and detail of causal factors data. There's a lot of data there now, and I think the improvements on API 754 are going to help us to further improve that and give us better insights going forwards into the future, and then continuing to understand and address the role of human organizational performance in process safety is really important and needs to be a key part of what APS does going forwards. So that concludes everything I was going to talk about this morning. Thanks again for your time, and I think at this point we'll take we've got a little bit of time here to take some questions. So.
Hey, thank you very much, Neil. Very informative presentation, and thanks to everybody that has contributed through the APS process and networking. Very impactful. We got a question coming in: is where does walk the line type incidents kind of now rank within that hierarchy of process safety incidents?
I don't have the data in front of me, but I know it's dropped. So I think that there's definite data there that shows that the walk the line effort across the industry has shown some improvement. Unfortunately, I don't have the exact numbers to be able to say. So
yeah, no worries. Hey, as we wait for additional questions to come in, I've got one for you. The regional process safety networks have been pretty impactful in sharing and developing best practices. So I'm sure the northern tier refineries are looking forward to kind of helping develop kind of the winterization or sharing the winterization practices that we continue to learn from on an annual basis. So how do you engage them through the APS process to get that flow of best practices for everyone to take a look at?
That's a great question, actually, Bill. Yeah, because I guess with the way we're kind of set up regionally with those networks, maybe that information wouldn't necessarily flow. But I think that's something where the overall APS subgroups can help with getting it. Again, I'd kind of say it's not like we don't know as an industry kind of how to manage winterization, and I think some of what the data is telling us, what February of 2021 is telling us, that we need to just share that knowledge and implement some of that knowledge better at some of the southern facilities. Hey, maybe while I on that slightly different subject, so a little plug for one of the things that APS is doing is setting up some regional networks for mechanical integrity that would get an opportunity for inspection type folks to get together and share practices and share information. I think that's another really good expansion of the positive networking and info sharing of APS.
So another comment that came in was little suggestion that maybe we include some additional guidance on near miss severity classification. Is that something within kind of the strategic plan that APS is working?
That's a good question. Yeah, so there's a pretty clear. So API 754 has a pretty clear table in there around how to put a severity score to an incident, and I've used that, and I found that to be pretty clear. We are developing in our company as well. I kind of talked a little bit about the fact that the API severity doesn't take potential into account, and so we've kind of developed we're developing internal metrics that take that into account a little bit more. So I don't know if I'm not sure if that answers the question or not. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Neil. Appreciate the excellent presentation and discussion, and well done. And really want to thank everybody for being able to pivot and join us and capture the learnings and continue to drive forward in everything we've done around occupational and process safety to make the industry safer. I appreciate everybody's support during this time. Please stay safe. Please make sure you join us for the Safety Awards recognition and the Advancing Process Safety panel, which Neil is a part of, and that's starting at 11:30 Central Time. Thanks so much and stay safe.